So let's go ahead and get started. You're in the right place. This is about information architecture. So I used to live in Baltimore for many, many years, moved to Canada, so just a play on words. How do Also, a quick note, sponsors, they keep the summit and our community alive. So here are some of the sponsors that we have for the summit this time. I'm sure you've seen the signs as well. But since you're getting started here, information architecture, I think personally, at least from my observation, having worked on this for quite a number of years now, it's starting to lose its meaning in our culture. I think people think that information architecture is about content types or a sitemap, and it's certainly significantly more than just content types and sitemaps. And there's the practice of trying to find things and understand things. That's our main goal here. So before we get started, I'm Chad Hester. I've been doing web stuff for 25 years now. I've been working pretty much mostly with Drupal for about 15 years, working a lot with information architecture and user experience for about 12. And of course, being very active in the open source and UX communities is really important to me. I recently started a freelance company called Mindite. I've got a couple business cards and some stickers up here if you want any. But I'm also looking for work, so as any freelancer does. So if you know of anybody, come please talk to me, take my card, take a look at my LinkedIn if you'd like. So a few acronyms, because of course we have all these 2-3 letter sort of words. IA is information architecture, UX is user experience, UI is user interface. There is a difference between the two. KPI, because it does come up, is a key performance indicator, how you measure success. And PMF, lesser known, is a performance measurement framework. So if you see those words, now you know what they are. So just show of hands, how many business owners here? Anyone? Okay, a couple. Sales, marketing, I imagine kind of an overlap there. All right, and how about developers? Okay, certainly an important perspective from an IA standpoint. Designers, okay, very well represented. I think website managers, manage the content, that sort of thing, okay. Digital strategists, content strategists, okay. UX researcher. All right, and QA tester, make sure things work after they're built. All right, anybody else? Any other roles that I haven't really thought of here? Cool. Well, it's important that I understand who's here because I want to make sure that we touch the things related to information architecture that apply to your job. And of course, when you have questions, I at least know what to anticipate. So also, is this a presentation for you? We want to address what is information architecture. We want to dispel those myths that it's just content types and sitemaps. We also want to make sure that you understand what impact it has on user experience and design and how to create an effective information architecture. So this link goes to these slides, so if you wanted to see this after the fact, there are references in each one of the slides, speaker notes for books and articles and things like that might be helpful for you. So I'll leave that on screen for just a second. Okay, so let's get into it. What is information architecture? Information architecture is the practice of structuring and organizing information environments to help people find and manage information more efficiently. It's like city planning, but for information, ensuring that people can navigate content as easily as they can navigate streets. So wayfinding, just orienting yourself. And then when you see these things, you need to understand the language that you're being presented. So is it a word that you personally understand? Really good resource, and I couldn't recommend this more than many of the other things. It does read a little bit like a textbook, but if you really want to know a lot of the fundamental principles and how this applies from either a design, a digital strategy, a development, even as a business stakeholder, the Polar Bear book is the de facto book to go to. I think they're in version 4. But the biggest quote that I like to pull up is this: information architecture is a design discipline that is focused on making information findable and understandable. So if I'm not speaking your language, then we're not making a connection. Or if I don't give you waypoints that make sense to you for you to make good decisions to complete a task, then, well, it's not findable either. So that could be navigation, search, even if you're on an article page, like what is the related content, that sort of thing. So good information architecture is like the foundation of a building. It's invisible but crucial. Poor IA can lead users to frustration, it can cause technical debt, and it can even result in lost business. Maybe you can't get to the product page. Maybe the button to buy just isn't obvious to you. I mean, simple things. According to the IA for the Web and Beyond, the book that we were just looking at, IA helps make information accessible, useful, and also reduces the likelihood of users leaving out of frustration. An important statistic is about 40% of users leave websites that are hard to navigate. So let's just overcome that problem first. There are 5 points to IA, and we'll talk about each one of these. Content structure, I don't call it content types, because there's certainly more to content structure than content types. I'm sure we've used paragraphs and all these different things in Drupal. And depending on what system you're using, whether it's Drupal, WordPress, or anything that you're using, content structure is still something that we can identify. What is the structure, and how might that potentially change over time? We want to talk about the difference between how do we structure information, like an event has a date, oftentimes a location, some sort of a description, sometimes even a schedule. And this is where things like schema.org can come in. And that's different than your display itself. Display is what you might explore first in wireframes. Labeling is the words that you choose to use. Words matter. So the labels that are in the user interface for your navigation, for your search options, or just even headings, things like that. We talked about search. What does the result actually look like? Does it inform a decision? We want to reduce decision fatigue as much as possible, so search certainly helps. Same thing with navigation. Are there too many choices? So that's a certainly an important part. And taxonomy, the way that we classify information. This isn't about administration. A lot of times people just want to dump tons of tags into their content, but how does that actually serve our audience? We want to make sure that we use a taxonomy with labels that's appropriate for the audience themselves. So are these product categories? Are these news types? Are these categories that they understand for the information that they would even be coming to your website for in the first place? So to break that down a little bit, we really want to be thoughtful about each one of these individual points as we explore the exercises that we can do to try to give this some definition. So first we start with the why and the who, and we kind of develop these sort of things. So just understanding our goal is to develop these things and define these things, and we'll certainly get there. This is just our target. So how does it impact user experience and design? So, obviously that's the most familiar thing for all of us. I'm sure we've all been to a website and said, I don't understand, or I can't find what I'm looking for. Well, that's an IA problem, just not wayfinding. I'm sure we've sometimes gone to an unfamiliar building like this one and said, where in the world is room 271? That's IA in the physical world. These are labels that you see that tell you what to do and what your choices are, the affordances, if you will. I made this a while ago. I had this idea that a lot of what we see is like the tip of an iceberg, but a lot of what goes behind what is built kind of brings that to the surface. So information architecture is one of those things that a lot of times you don't really even see it. It exists when you need it. So if I'm on the home page, I don't see the search page, but it's there and it's a part of the system and it's part of our planning. We need to understand that pages don't exist in a vacuum. It's a journey. There are steps in a process that a person wants to take, and it's our responsibility to understand those steps and to test those steps and to model them and then make improvements and come back and continue to improve. So that's our ideas. We want to build something and test often. I also like to point out that IA is just a part of this massive Venn diagram. This is the disciplines of user experience design. And as you can see, there are some things that are even outside of our typical, Drupal community. When we build websites, we're not often thinking of like motion design or sound engineering, but this is all a part of an experience, especially highly interactive websites, industrial design. But IA is smack dab in a dominant part of this overall user experience design circle. So whenever people say there's bad user experience, I like to point out that IA is a huge contributor to that. It's not the only one though.
Sorry, can you say that last sentence one more time?
Yeah. IA is a huge contributor to user experience.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. It's not the only one, but it's big. So how do you create or improve an IA? I mean, if you're coming up with a brand new website, you don't have much, and you have a lot that you need to establish, some context. You need to talk to your audience. You need to talk to stakeholders, subject matter experts. There's a lot to really cover. So typically, you'll be working as a team. Sometimes you'll be by yourself, and that's okay, but we serve other human beings. We need to get those human beings involved. It's not a technical issue, it's first and foremost a human issue. So establish who's on your team, understand who that is. Support users is a concept where, of course, if you have students at a university, for example, you can't talk to every student that's going to go to the website. I mean, you can try, but you might have some feedback in a feedback form. But a support user is people that you can solicit for things like beta testing and making sure that whatever it is that you've built, you actually put it through the paces of testing. Okay, here's a task. Can you do it? Let's observe you. And there are a few different ways of doing that. Stakeholders, of course, are people who can guide you through not only the decision-making process that they need to make for whatever project you have, but they are also responsible. We want to prop them up for success. So those stakeholders are pretty important to establish very early in a project. I'm sure we've all had a project where a stakeholder comes in a little bit late and they just table flip the whole thing. So establish that from day one. As subject matter experts, they'll overlap with your stakeholders. A lot of times your stakeholders are subject matter experts, like talking to a librarian if you're working on the library site. But subject matter experts go outside of your stakeholders. And these are people that you also want to try to identify because they are the boots on the ground. They are the people managing the content that might not be necessarily in the room when you're doing a discovery or doing design concepts. Of course, there's people like us, depending on your role. You might consider yourself an information architect in your role, or a user experience designer, or user interface designer. Yes, they are different. User interface is a visual thing, and user experience is a feeling. We want to make sure that people feel comfortable with the systems they want to use. They don't want to be frustrated, and that takes testing, research, planning. Developers and strategists, of course, need to be at the table as well. So I think once you identify all of these people, you've got the who pretty well understood, or at least a really good, strong, healthy starting point. So we talked about the 5 points of IA. This is the path to get to that definition. So I really wanted to focus first on, well, what is IA? What's our goal? What are we trying to define? But before we get there, we need to establish some context. I think a lot of times people are very quick to, let's just build a website, let's test it. But if you don't understand some fundamentals, then you're going to have to go back and it's going to get expensive to do that. So this is cheap. It's really cheap to have a conversation. It's really cheap to do a wireframe or even a sketch on a whiteboard about what an event page would look like. So you'll see that I put IA and UX a lot of times beside each other because of that Venn diagram we looked at earlier. But first off, who? We were just talking about the people on your team. Well, it's also the users. Who's using this website? Sometimes you know really, really well, and sometimes you don't. Now, we talk about personas sometimes in UX. I would actually say take a step sideways. A persona is a design tool that is a fictional representation of a user in a system. Whereas an audience segment's a little bit different. So student, teacher, those are just audience segments. You're not saying anything about their motivations, you're not giving them a name, you're just saying who they are. There's different ways to sub-segment from there using demographics or other motivations, some sort of backstory, but start simple. Who's your users? What do you know? What do your stakeholders know? And what do the subject matters know about your audience? And then, of course, context. What sort of business constraints do you need to be aware of when developing a website? That could be budgetary, that could be the technology that's available. This could simply be a design system that you're working with. Just understand some of those constraints. And your goal, again, I can't say it enough, is to get to a testable thing. So those contexts will really help frame things out for you. And content. A lot of times people look at IA and don't understand it's the bucket that you want to fill. It's not the contents of the bucket, it's just the structure that you're creating to fill that. So a blog post content type, that's just an empty bucket ready for blog posts. So when you create your content structure for the blog post, maybe you have a title, maybe you have some taxonomy tags, a body of course, there may even be a publication date or an author byline or something like that. That doesn't tell you what goes in it. So I think what really helps, especially if you have an existing website, is pull specimens, good examples of what a blog post looks like, because that can inform what does that structure need to be. Maybe you're migrating into a new Drupal site. This is an opportunity to improve your information architecture. So don't even worry about trying to define the what until you understand the why. So the content is part of that why. What sort of specimens can we have? How can people try to understand that? What do we know about our audience and their perception of a blog post or event or course description? So the point that I'm making is the good research yields good information architecture. You skip that step and you go right into the definition. Well, you're making lots of assumptions that haven't been validated, and that's irresponsible. So let's be responsible. We want to put this into action. And the best thing that I can recommend is first identify what your questions are. Establish what you know, and then find where your questions actually exist. And do that as a team. Just start listing them out and then prioritize those questions together. Visual communication is another really important tool to understanding information. So I think one of the biggest examples I could give you, and I know this isn't going to be on the recording, but I can at least say what I'm doing, is if all of us said, yes, we need to build shape. We all agree, we're shape. So maybe in my mind, I'm thinking, square. Yeah, square's good. In your mind, you're thinking, no, triangle. But if we haven't had that conversation, then, well, there's a missed opportunity. Is there a compromise between those two that we need to discuss? Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to diagram things out. So there's page flow diagrams or user flows. There's sitemaps. It's really, what are you trying to discuss? What are you trying to explore? A sitemap is really good from a bird's eye view. It's what we call a top-down artifact. Whereas a page flow is, I'm trying to understand a course and then maybe register for that. So that's good for a bottom-up artifact, like a page flow diagram. And as the information architect, or as part of a team, we need to facilitate good stakeholder workshops to understand things, but also facilitate workshops with actual support users. So for example, maybe you don't know what types of events people want to attend at the university. So let's talk to them. Let's do some card sorting exercises. Let's understand, well, what sort of events already exist that might go on the website, and then try to classify those together with actual support users. I think something that we miss sometimes, because we're just so eager to get right into the thick of work, we miss discussing what success looks like. Now, I have a separate presentation on this, so I won't go deep into it, but it is later this afternoon. That's the performance measurement framework, is how do we define success together as a team? That's usually something like KPIs and OKRs. KPIs is key performance indicators. These are not page views or bounce rates. These are things like profit that a for-profit company might have, or the number of course registrations that you might be getting through a website. Things that are measurable to indicate the website is being successful for the organization. And then we can extrapolate, well, what sort of features support those KPIs? And you prioritize those. It's not just a feature shopping exercise. It's something that we can say, if we had to pick between A, B, and C, we can only pick one. What aligns most with what success theoretically looks like, and just focus on that, test it, build it, and then if we still have budget and time afterward, then at least we got the most important thing done. And after you build something, how do you know it's working? Unless you not only test it with people, but to see, are the measurements that we're making for, again, something like course registrations, is the website's feature actually helping that? Maybe you improve it, maybe you add to it, maybe you even remove something that might be an obstacle for that. Test, learn, and repeat. I always want to bring it back to the lean UX idea of the build, measure, learn loop. So back to users. Again, you really want to understand your audience, and to really break that down, there are a lot of different exercises to do this research. Cohort analysis, user surveys, talking to your stakeholders and subject matter experts. Establish what those audience segments look like early. It's a quick definition, and if you don't know, then knowing that before you get involved creates this level of empathy. And then from there, if you want to do things like user personas or customer journey maps or anything like that, you can certainly do that. Prototyping is important, user testing is important once you start to build those things. But another thing that I like to really think about in terms of I'm about to build a website is, what do we want people to do? It's not just, here's the fire hose of information. It's what are the tangible human problems that we're trying to solve with this, and what affordances do we have? So it's the Venn diagram of organizational goals and affordances and user needs. They do not fully overlap as a circle. Sometimes the user needs, you're just unaware of them. So there's an opportunity there. Or sometimes there's a strategy in your organization where it's like, okay, I'm aware the user wants that. We're not going to do that though. But make that a conscious decision, not just an assumption. And then there are other tools, simple tools. Greg's session touched a little bit on the idea of doing user surveys. Well, user surveys, user interviews, talking to people, especially one-to-one as well as in group settings. One-to-one, you might get a little bit more honesty. People can be a little bit more candid, feel a little less influenced by their constituents. It's important to try a mix of both of those things. And then if you have an existing system or if you're building something, again, test. It seems like a lot, but it should be a lot. If we're not failing early, then we missed an opportunity and we're investing entirely too much in something that could be a major loss. So I know we're talking more abstract and theoretical, but those are the exercises that I think that you can learn about on your own as well. And why should we build or improve the website or system? Let's again shift from the what, the feature shopping, and come back to what is the fundamental purpose of the website. So talk to stakeholders and SMEs and users and just get a better, tighter understanding of that. We talked about success, facilitating things through workshops, requirements gathering. This can feel really heavy after a while. And the best way to lighten that up is to gather what you have, prioritize it as a team, and then just focus on the most important things first, so that way you can build something. This is a bit of the agile methodology where you focus on things in sprints that you can produce and test, then recycle. But I've seen this work in agencies that swear by waterfall as well. Some other things that may help you with some context, there's some exercises like priority maps, user story maps, things like that. Again, workshops that help taking a look at something from a slightly different perspective can be really helpful. So if I have an e-commerce store as an example, Well, what sort of products or services do you sell? Let's kind of talk about that. Okay, what does that mean to the audience? What's your typical customer? Let's kind of talk about that. And map these out together as a group so that way you can better understand the general context, maybe any sort of feedback that you've gotten from customers, or in this case, users, if you will. System diagrams and integration research, I want to call this out a little bit as an aside because while it is a little bit more technical connectivity matters when it comes to IA. This is that hidden IA side of things. So for example, if you integrate with a CRM system, or if there's a separate system to populate your course descriptions or things like that in a university setting, these are all things that you need to account for that define that content structure and are a bit of that, guardrails that you have to work within. So by working with, if you're not technical yourself, working with your developers to understand what are those system and database connections, what are those APIs, what affordances are in the background? Do we need to make that user facing, or is that just working in the background to help us? Maybe it already gives us taxonomy and we just have to work within that frame. So that's why I think, obviously diagramming those systems and understanding the impact on user-facing IA is really good. Also, admin AI, or IA. I think it's important to understand how is content actually created. It's oftentimes the last thought of thing is the user experience of the person who's managing the website. But I think being thoughtful and consistent with the interfaces that we create, having clear descriptions, things like that, can really go a long way. And that's where I think content really is something that you need to sit down with. This isn't what it looks like. It's just simply what it is. What's in a blog post? What's in an event? What is a course description? What is a product? Trying to understand it first from an information standpoint, and then taking that and putting it into a sketch or a wireframe is a good way to start to evaluate that movement between what is just the information by itself, which could be coming from a back-end system, and bring it to the surface of how we want to present it. And how you present information is going to be different in different contexts. So if I'm looking at an event calendar, I can't show you absolutely every nugget of information. If I'm looking at a blog, which is a list of blog posts, I'm not going to show you the body of all of those things. So I just need to give you enough to avoid decision fatigue, enough for you to make an informed decision so that you can find the information that you have. So understanding not only the information that's available, but in what context is that going to be used throughout the website? And that can change. Is your content structure malleable enough or supportive enough for all of those different use cases? So again, wireframes are cheap. Don't get into visual design too early because you can still test wireframes. So again, we're trying to take the research that we do to inform the definition, that why before the what, and certainly before the how. Now, again, I'm being abstract. Why is this important for the business? Why is this important for your users? Why is this going to make a difference to the world? And if you don't know that, start to try to answer those questions. If you don't know, leave that question on the board. Just say, hey, we need to figure this out at some point. The what is your IA or your design. And the how is the technology, whether it's Drupal or something else, that helps realize that what. So it's just building that understanding. I think another common thing, I like that Greg pulled this up in his session last, is things can scale. You start off a website maybe with a news content type, very typical. But what if you need a very special press release content type? Sometimes they fork and sometimes you just have, it's just a type of news. Well, that's where design really starts to come in. What are the systems that are responsible for maintaining that information, the data authority, if you will? If it's not the CMS, does it come from something else like a feed or something along those lines? And how is it used? A press release is inherently a very official position, and the way that you present it on, say, a university page may be a different design than what you may have for just a more casual news post, like who won the latest football game at the university. It's not nearly as important as some very serious subject. This build, measure, learn loop. The presentation I'm doing later today talks a little bit about that, but that comes from the Lean Startup. It's a really good book that talks about really holding yourself accountable for success. But in this case, it's just you want to build something, You want to see how it performs, and then you want to learn from that process and just loop and loop and loop through that to make rapid improvements. That's the ideal. Like, you don't invest in marketing one time. It's an ongoing experience. So content structure. We talked a little bit about the research. Now let's circle back to these goals that we have to create a good, effective information architecture. So some questions that you really want to ask yourself should be focused on the information environment, how it's meant to be understood, how it's meant to be used. So just a handful, how should it be structured? Well, you work through that through a few exercises. What sort of fields do you have? And you can go way off the deep end with this. The one recommendation I typically make with content type field structures is try to avoid the temptation to make the field structure about how it's displayed. Don't try to think a little bit less about how it's displayed and more about how it's used in multiple contexts and how that might change over time. So again, blog post is title, maybe a publication date, maybe a byline. But do you want to start with the byline from the very beginning? Maybe, maybe not. Does it have use to your users? If you have 5 blog posts, no one cares who the author is. But if you have 500, it might be pretty important to see all the blog posts from a single person. It's just, is it getting lost in the context? And sometimes you have a relationship between content types that you need to explore. So maybe I have an event that has a location, but maybe that location should list all the events that exist at it, maybe from a resourcing standpoint or something like that. This really enriches the findability of content. So if I'm, at this building here, what classes exist in this building today? If I have a system that can answer that question, I'm not looking at all of the other contexts. And this can help with search as well. Just understanding those relationships can make a very big impact for an author of a blog post. So there are a few different artifacts to consider. We said diagrams before. Content strategy, yes, that's a practice. But if you have an inventory, which you should always start with if you have existing content, or if you're planning new content for a website, have an inventory. The less content you have to manage, the easier it is to manage. It really cuts through the noise for your audience. And if you had a marketing strategy 5 years ago and had tons of content that probably really isn't applicable anymore, maybe you should archive that, get rid of it, focus on the things that you should be doing. Less to manage is easier to manage. Priority guides. So priority guide, if you're not familiar, I think Alyssa Part actually had a really cool article about this, where before you do wireframes, force yourself to do effectively a wireframe, but just in mobile. And what that does is it says, here are the different fields that I have for an event, let's say. What's the first most important field? That's the first priority. That's the first thing in the list. Nothing is ever stacked left to right. It's all top to bottom. So that's what a priority guide is. It says, here are the fields and the level of importance for every single one of those fields. And if you feel like maybe field B is about the same as field C, just make a choice. And from there, what that does is, for your admin UX, it decides how to present those fields in a form. And it also helps inform where to go next with your wireframes. And then it takes your visual designers and it lets them be very thoughtful about design accents, things to catch the eye, things to create visual hierarchy on the page. You may think that somebody hits a page and reads the whole thing. They do not. They skim and scan. And if they don't see something they recognize to make a decision, or then maybe read a course description, then, well, they'll feel disoriented, and then we've already failed our first point of IA, which is making things findable and understandable. Wireframes, of course, design mockups, prototypes can be tested through things like Figma. And an IA spreadsheet, this is where you might define those fields before you start building it. This is good for developers so they can reference it. This is good for designers so they know what the fields are, what sort of data type it is, so they know how to properly represent it, show them examples of this. And then when a QA tester comes along and tests what was built, they can reference that same sheet as well. Taxonomy. This is something that can be very broad or very slim and narrow. It could just be simple tags like Twitter hashtags or something like that to help make connections between content. That gets very unkempt, so be careful with tags. But more rigid taxonomy, like if I have different news, I might have one for sports, one for politics, things like that. Things that your users understand. But card sorting exercises, an inventory of any existing taxonomy, making sure that the labels are understood by the users by doing things like tree tests and seeing if they'll choose the options that are available. And again, we always talk about wireframes, mockups, prototypes. This is recurring. This is always present in a lot of the artifacts that we have, is these different considerations for information architecture. The words that we choose matter. And if we don't know, we have to make an educated guess with subject matter experts, but make note of that. Say, we don't know, we didn't test this, let's test this. It's a debt that we have to pay. Navigation. I'm sure you've all opened a website that has a mega menu, and if you're floating over it, maybe it disappears. That is a usability issue. And sometimes these mega menus have so many choices. It's what I refer to as the diner menu syndrome. We've all been to a diner. We've opened the Bible that tells us how much food there is. When are you going to place your order? It's going to take you at least 10 minutes. Well, thankfully, a lot of diner menus will group things, and we can do that too, is group things by logical things to help minimize. I just want dessert. So just show me dessert. Let me do that. And you want to limit choices. There's something called Miller's Law, or the magical rule of 7, plus or minus 2. So 5 to 9 choices is the ideal choice for any human. Anything more than that, you get a cognitive fatigue, especially when you deal with things like scientific terminology or academic. You get these really long words. All of this is costing your users a little bit cognitively. And if they have something like dyslexia, you're just making it that much worse. So simplify things, make it clear, make it understandable. And this just takes intention through research, and then building a prototype, and then testing it, and then just repeating. Search strategy is the same thing like navigation. You just want to sit down and be very thoughtful about the options. Can you make tons of different facets and filters and stuff like that? Well, yeah, and that would be really important if you had a library website, or maybe something as complex as Amazon. But in most cases, you don't need all of those options. Start with something simple, test it, see if that works, because it's less to build, it's faster to test to see if it's effective. And then maybe you might introduce a filter for content type, or a filter for some sort of a category, or maybe an author. But it's really contextual to what you have as an organization to afford people in terms of content, and what the user understands and what they're trying to do. So it's just the marriage between those two things. So again, different artifacts can help you understand just the general context of how search really comes into play here. And you'll notice a theme. A lot of these things repeat. So you get efficiencies by doing card sorting. You get efficiencies by defining your taxonomy in one place. It informs your navigation. It informs your search. It informs, like, if I have a blog page, where does the taxonomy go on that? Is it clickable? Does it take me to a taxonomy page? Does that help me find more things? So the biggest thing that I can tell you is repeat everything. And it seems expensive to say that, but if you're doing things in small, testable chunks, it's not that bad. You're always coming back and demonstrating your work. No one wants to see you disappear for hundreds of hours or several months just to come up with something that is a steaming pile. Mm-hmm. You want to test a little bit and show the people who you are responsible to, who are paying these bills, or at least that you're accountable for if you're in a department or something, those measures of success. What's your progress? What's the deliverable that we have? And sometimes something small and testable is it. And if there's not consensus amongst your stakeholders, like, well, I don't know if the users will like that, your answer is, well, let's go test it with those users. So it's less of ego-driven design. It's more practical, and get it in front of the human beings that we're serving. So I just wanted to wrap up some continuous improvements. I want to say, because I keep saying learn. Well, we all learn. And part of the strategy for learning, I think, is to understand where you are. So we're talking about information architecture. Was this unknown before you came into this, or have you at least just encountered it? You know the word, you just don't know much about it. Or are you acquainted? You've read a couple of things. Maybe you've actually studied some books and read some of the books that are really helpful. Experience is where you actually put that into practice, though. And I think this is a distinction that we make a lot of times in academia, but I think we really need to call that out. Just because you've read a book doesn't mean that you've actually tried these things out. So practice, see how it works, and figure out how your knowledge may not match your real world experience with what's practical. And mastery takes time. It means that you've made those mistakes. But understand where you are in your journey of learning, whether it's IA or about your client. And how can you learn more? Well, find a mentor. Find someone that knows about IA, or attend something like this, a social event. Point being is there are a lot of different places to gather knowledge and to put that knowledge into practice. Some resources. These are always good, not by far a limit. The Polar Bear book I couldn't recommend more, but it does read a bit like a textbook. If you want something that's super easy to read, that even your clients can read, How to Make Sense of Any Mess. It's so playful and easy to understand. It makes things feel very light and less encumbered. Content Strategy for the Web. There's also a podcast. It's fantastic. Christina Halverson does a really good job of really just, again, kind of keeping things light, but focusing on what can you achieve very quickly as a team, and where should you start. There are a couple other books, but UX Design CC is a really great UX resource in general. And Nielsen Norman Group. If you don't know who Nielsen Norman Group is, then welcome. This is one of the most well-known user experience organizations that exist. Don Norman used to work for Apple, and he wrote a fantastic book. It's The Design of Everyday Things. If you've never read this, it's so fun. It is absolutely a fun book. There's also an audiobook where he does read it, and it's really enjoyable. So that's it. Thank you for participating. There's QR code there and a link to these slides if you want to see. Every slide has not just speaker notes, but it does have like a little suggestion about what a resource could be to help you along the way. I know we covered a whole lot. And the point of this wasn't so much to say, here's how you do tree testing. You can research that on your own. How do you do card sorting? This is more just to kind of give you a lay of the land, to understand where to start, why you're starting there, and some things to at least consider. So, I'm Chad. If you know anyone that wants to hire someone like me, give me a shout. And yeah, thank you. Any questions?
Well, if you were to encounter a very dense, messy website with gazillion pages, where would you begin?
Sure. So first, I would. There are a few places that I'd like to begin. Where I typically personally like to begin after identifying who can help me. So that's definitely rule number one, is find out who can help me. Because when I have a very specific question, just understanding how to answer that question is really important. But then I focus on what are the organization goals. It's real high level. Sometimes it feels very obvious to the people who you're working for and serving, like what needs to be done. Just putting it on paper, writing it down, having people look at it and say, wait a minute, that's not right. It's the consensus that we want to develop in terms of what are the goals of the organization. But also, who's the audience and what do they need? So I think even if we don't know all the answers, at least just getting some baselines of that. But if it has tons of content, this is where we're getting more specific into. This is this project that we're working on. So I think a content inventory is a fantastic place. Sometimes that's using a Screaming Frog to crawl the whole website and just get a loose collection of it, put it in a spreadsheet, and then collaborate with a team to see, okay, is there any content that you just don't need? Let's get that off and ignore that. Is there any content that you have to have? It's essential for things, you know it is, let's identify that. Then you're gonna have a big gray area in the middle. And you don't have to work on that now, but at least you've gotten like the hard part out of the way, and then you can focus on at least the must-haves and the maybe-haves to try to understand, okay, let's talk about how this is represented in an information system on your current site, maybe through an integration, and what you know about user frustrations as they try to find that content and understand that content. And I think with that initial understanding, that can kind of inform next steps.
You mentioned Screaming Frog. Are there other tools that you like to use for that?
I think Screaming Frog's good for just getting a big swath of existing content that's public, but not all systems are public. So you might actually need some sort of help from someone that connects to the system to do an actual export of just at least the basics to help understand. There's also Google Analytics, of course, which can tell you what are the most popular pages. There are a few other similar sort of SEO tools. Again, if it's a private site, you may have other analytical tools. But yeah, those are the first things that I typically start with, depending on the context.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
How do you decide when to start with like a site inventory versus a blank slate approach when working with clients?
Oh, yeah, good question. So if you have a site inventory, it's typically because you have existing content, even if it's not on the web. Maybe it's just a bunch of PDFs or some sort of documentation that you might have. It's still a good place to start because it's a known quantity that you can kind of negotiate around. But I think mapping things out is a bit more intention. So you're shifting from the why into that what space, which is fine. Sometimes that's especially helpful if you're evaluating a current state. But when making improvements, I think humans don't like to suffer. So we're quickly looking for the quickest path out of suffering, but sometimes we need to suffer a little bit together and understand that we don't need to solve every problem. So I think establishing that context very early of what do you have, what do you want to provide, what are you trying to achieve, and what does your audience care about? We need to meet somewhere in the middle of that Venn diagram to make sure that we're making those connections. So I think there are a few different ways to do that, different ways to diagram, different ways to kind of explore things with test users or stakeholders. Okay. Yeah.
Have you found any, back to like the messy
Yeah.
site example, have you found any AI tools useful for assessing like content structure like that?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Always this disclaimer, AI can't be fully trusted. And I say that not because of some sort of like even ethical thing. It's more a matter of like it's fallible like us because we trained it on us. But that said, I think AI cannot be used to scrape a website. Most AI will tell you that unless you use an API. But that said, you can actually plug AI into something like Screaming Frog and have it do some things. AI can be really great. A little deviation from what you're asking, but I don't want to forget is AI can be really helpful for things like establishing alt text for your images. It's just these little affordances. But back to your thought though, is maybe I don't know how to classify my content. Maybe I can sit down and say, here's a spreadsheet, which you can feed a spreadsheet to AI. Can you come up with a list of categories based on this set of information? Maybe from the titles, maybe from the headings, worst case from a full text search. How do you categorize this? That might be a good starting point for a closed card sort, and then maybe an open card sort might just be the grouping mechanism for them. It's okay if it gets it wrong because you're not relying on it as this is the solution, you're relying on it more as just help me ideate a little bit. Let's skip a few steps ahead and not worry about whiteboarding it with a team of stakeholders who might be hard to schedule in a meeting.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you very much. I have cards here if you wanted to get in touch with me, and I'll have a session, I think it's at 2:15 or something this afternoon about a performance measurement framework if you want to attend that.
Woo!
Yay!